They called his code a relic. That was the first and last mistake Julian Croft would ever make. The words echoed in the glass-walled war room of Innovatech, a space usually buzzing with the electric hum of progress. But today the only sound was the slow, agonizing bleat of failure. Red error logs scrolled down the massive monitors like digital blood. Julian, the company's CEO, a man who wore charisma like a tailored suit and knew just enough tech jargon to sound brilliant, paced the room, his face a mask of controlled fury. His empire was crumbling, live, in front of the very investors he'd promised the moon. He needed a sacrifice, a body to place on the altar of blame. His eyes landed on Marcus. Marcus Cole, the silent man in the corner, the company's ghost. He sat before his terminal, his face illuminated by the cascading red text, his expression unreadable. For 15 years, Marcus had been the architect of this digital world. He wasn't just a coder, he was the foundation, the load-bearing walls. The system's very soul was written in the language of his mind. Julian pointed a trembling finger, his voice slicing through the tension. "This is on you, Marcus, your legacy code. It's a house of cards." The room went silent, every head turned. The engineers, the project managers, the fresh-faced Stanford grads Julian had hired to make the company look innovative, they all stared. Julian walked over to Marcus's desk. He sneered at the keyboard Marcus was using, an old ergonomic relic from the early 2000s, its keys worn smooth and blank from millions of keystrokes. A keyboard Julian had mocked in meetings for years. "We're running a multi-billion-dollar platform and you're using a museum piece to hold it together. Your methods are antiquated, your systems are a bottleneck. You," Julian leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "are the problem." Marcus slowly looked up, his eyes, calm and deep, met Julian's. He didn't flinch, he didn't argue. He just held his gaze, a quiet storm brewing behind his silence. "You're done," Julian snapped, louder now for the whole room to hear. "Pack your things, we need fresh blood, not dead weight. Security will see you out." Marcus blinked once. He looked around the room at the faces of the colleagues who had depended on his work for years, the ones who called him at 3 a.m. when their own brilliant code failed. None of them met his eye. They looked at their shoes, at the screens, anywhere but at him. He turned back to his station. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He didn't pack a box of personal trinkets, he didn't have any. His life was the code. Instead, he carefully unplugged the old keyboard. He coiled the wire with a practiced hand and slid it into his worn leather messenger bag. It was the only thing he took. As he stood, he looked at Julian Croft one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, chilling pity. "The system is not the problem, Julian," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a prophecy. "The problem is you don't understand what you're breaking." He walked out of the room, the glass door hissed shut behind him. And in the silence he left behind, a new error message flashed on the main screen. A single, ominous line of white text against a black background. "System integrity compromised, root access denied." Julian stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He didn't know what it meant. But he was about to find out. The first hour after Marcus left felt like a reprieve. Julian, high on the adrenaline of his power play, brought in his star hire, a 24-year-old coding prodigy from MIT named Seth, and grandly gestured to the main console. "Fix it," he commanded. "Scrub Marcus's old junk from the system. Build it better." Seth, full of the unshakable confidence of youth, cracked his knuckles and dove in. The other engineers, eager to please their CEO, buzzed around him, offering suggestions, running diagnostics. They were the new guard, the future. But the machine had other ideas. The first system to die was payroll. It just stopped. The portal went dark, the data became inaccessible. An hour later, the client-facing interface began to glitch. Users were getting locked out, transactions were failing. The error logs weren't just scrolling anymore, they were screaming. A torrent of unintelligible warnings that Seth couldn't decipher. "It's like the code is healing itself," Seth muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Every time I patch a vulnerability, two more appear. It's fighting back." Julian, watching from his office, felt his stomach clench. He barked into his phone at the head of engineering. "What do you mean it's fighting back? Code doesn't fight back." "This code does, Julian," the engineer said, his voice strained. "It's Marcus's architecture. It's labyrinthine. It's brilliant, but it's old. It's woven together in ways we don't understand. He built safeguards into it, redundancies. It's like he knew one day someone might try to tear it down without knowing what they're doing." Julian slammed the phone down. He looked at the stock ticker on his second monitor. It was starting to dip. Investors were calling. The company's biggest client, a massive e-commerce platform, had their entire operation frozen, millions of dollars returning to smoke with every passing minute. He stormed back into the war room. Where are we? Seth looked up, his face pale. The youthful arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. I can't get to the root. It's locked down, encrypted. There are layers of protocols I've never seen before. It's like a digital fortress, and we're on the outside. Only one person had the master key. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Marcus. Julian's mind flashed back to the way Marcus had looked at him, that look of pity. The problem is you don't understand what you're breaking. He had thought Marcus was talking about the code, but he was talking about the company, the whole damn thing. Julian's phone buzzed. It was his COO. The data servers are going offline, she said, her voice tight with panic. The backups too, they're being isolated, we're losing everything. Julian felt the floor drop out from under him. The company wasn't just failing, it was being erased, and the ghost in the machine was the man he had just thrown away. A week later, Julian Croft officially resigned. The board, having witnessed his public confession, had no choice. They offered Marcus the CEO position. He turned it down without a moment's hesitation. They offered him a massive consulting contract to stay on and manage the system. He turned that down too. He sent them a single invoice. 4 consulting services rendered. Amount $1. He didn't want their money, he didn't want their power. He had made his point. His final meeting was with Alina. She met him at the community center to give him his $1 check. The place was buzzing now. News of Marcus's story had spread. Donations had poured in. They had new computers, faster internet, and a waiting list for his class. What will you do now? Alina asked, handing him the check, which he folded and put in his pocket without looking at it. Marcus gestured to the room, to the kids huddled over their keyboards, their faces bright with discovery. This, he said, I'm going to keep doing this. He sat down at his old desk in front of his scarred keyboard. A young girl came up to him, pointing at a line of code on her screen. Mr. Cole, I think I broke it. Marcus looked at her code, then smiled. No, you didn't, he said, his voice gentle. You just found a new way to build. Alina watched them for a moment, the fallen tech giant and the future rising from the ashes of his empire. She finally understood. Julian Croft had spent his life building a castle of glass, fragile and beautiful and ultimately empty. Marcus was teaching children how to build foundations of stone. And as he placed his fingers on those worn, familiar keys, he typed out the first lesson of the day, a quiet victor in a war no one had known he was fighting. He had taken the ultimate revenge, not by destroying his enemy, but by choosing to build something better in his place. Some victories are not about what you win, they are about what you refuse to lose. 48 hours. That's how long it took for Innovatech to go from a tech giant to a digital wasteland. The website was a blank page, the app was a dead icon, the stock had plummeted by 60%. The news outlets, once singing Julian's praises, were now circling like vultures, using words like catastrophic failure, unprecedented collapse, and gross mismanagement. Julian hadn't slept. He lived in the war room, fueled by caffeine and sheer terror. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot. He had yelled at everyone. He had fired 3 more senior engineers. He had begged, threatened, and thrown a chair at a monitor. Nothing worked. Seth, the prodigy, had quit. He walked up to Julian, handed him his security badge, and said, "You didn't just fire a coder. You fired the system's god, and I'm not qualified to deal with acts of divine retribution." Julian was alone, a king sitting on a cardboard throne, watching his kingdom dissolve around him. His assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Alina who had been with him for years, walked in, holding a tablet. She was the only one who still looked him in the eye. "The board is calling an emergency meeting," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They want your resignation." Julian ran a hand through his hair, his composure finally shattering. "It's not my fault, it was the code, it was Marcus." Alina just looked at him. "Was it?" I pulled the server logs from the last 6 months. There were 147 critical failure warnings. Marcus flagged every single one of them. He proposed a system-wide overhaul 3 times. You denied the budget each time. You called it unnecessary overhead. She swiped the screen on the tablet, showing him a chain of emails. His own replies, dismissive and arrogant, stared back at him. "Focus on the new UI, Marcus. Stop getting bogged down in the back end." The truth hit Julian like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the shiny exterior, the paint job, the chrome, that he had ignored the rotting engine. Marcus hadn't been the bottleneck, he had been the dam holding back the flood, and Julian had just dynamited it. "Find him," Julian croaked, his voice raspy. "We've tried," Alina said. "His phone is off. His apartment is empty. He's not at any of his old haunts. It's like he vanished." "Then try harder," Julian roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Offer him whatever he wants. Money, stock options, my firstborn child, I don't care, just get him back here." Alina didn't move, she just watched her boss, the celebrated visionary, the titan of tech, unravel. "And what makes you think," she asked quietly, "that he wants anything you have to offer?" The question hung in the air, a final, damning verdict. Julian had nothing left, his money was worthless, his power was an illusion. He had built an empire on the back of a man he never bothered to see, and now he was nothing without him. They found him on the third day, not in a high-tech lab or a rival's office. They found him in the basement of a community center in the city's poorest neighborhood. Alina had been the one to track him down, using an old employee file that listed a volunteer position he'd held years ago. She'd gone herself, leaving Julian to stew in the wreckage of his own making. The basement was small, with fluorescent lights that hummed and cinder block walls painted a cheerful, if peeling, yellow. Marcus stood at the front of the room before a small group of teenagers. They were huddled around a collection of aging, donated computers. Marcus's own laptop was connected to a projector, displaying lines of clean, elegant code on a makeshift screen. His old, scarred keyboard was plugged into his laptop. His fingers moved across it with a fluid grace, his voice calm and patient as he explained the logic behind the code. "And that's a recursive function," Marcus was saying. "It's like a set of Russian dolls, a function that calls itself over and over until it solves the problem. It's about building elegance, not just making something that works, but something that works beautifully." A young girl with bright, curious eyes raised her hand. "But what if it breaks?" Marcus smiled, a real, genuine smile that Alina had never seen before. "Then you find the break, you understand why it happened, you don't blame the tool, you learn from the failure, you build it stronger, that's the whole point." Alina stood in the doorway unseen, her heart aching. This was the man Julian Croft had called dead weight. This was the relic he'd thrown away. He wasn't hiding, he was building, he was teaching. He was creating value far beyond anything Innovatech's stock price could measure. She watched for 10 minutes as he moved from student to student, looking over their shoulders, offering quiet encouragement, his presence a beacon of steady, unassuming brilliance. He wasn't a ghost in a machine, he was a lighthouse. Finally, she stepped into the room. Marcus looked up, his smile faded, but there was no surprise in his eyes. He knew this moment was coming. He excused himself from the class and walked over to her. "Alina," he said, his voice even. "Marcus," she replied, her own voice softer than she'd intended. "He sent me." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know. He's desperate." "He's losing money," Marcus corrected her gently. "That's not the same thing." "He wants you to come back," she said, the words feeling hollow and absurd in this room full of hope. "He'll give you anything, a new title, head of engineering, a blank check." Marcus looked past her at the kids still working diligently at their screens. He thought of the years he'd spent in that glass-walled prison, pouring his genius into a system for a man who didn't even care to understand it. He thought of the public humiliation, the averted eyes of his colleagues. He looked back at Elena, his gaze clear and firm. "A blank check can't buy back a man's soul," he said. "Tell Julian if he wants to talk to me, he can come here, and tell him to come alone." The drive to the community center was the longest journey of Julian Croft's life. He wasn't in his chauffeured town car. He was in his own luxury sedan, a car he hadn't personally driven in years. The GPS voice felt like a mocking narrator, guiding him to a part of the city he'd only ever seen from a boardroom window. He parked on the street, the gleaming silver car looking alien and obscene next to the faded murals and chain-link fences. He stepped out, his expensive leather shoes feeling clumsy on the cracked pavement. He saw the stares of people on the street. They didn't know who he was, but they knew he didn't belong. For the first time in his life, Julian felt the cold, uncomfortable sting of being the outsider. He found the basement room. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle, his heart pounding. He could hear Marcus's voice inside, patient and steady. He pushed the door open. The scene was exactly as Alina had described it. Marcus, standing before a group of eager kids, the light of the projector illuminating him like a scholar on a stage. He was in his element. He was home. Marcus saw him but didn't stop his lesson. He finished his thought, answered one last question from a student, and then said, "All right, let's take a 15-minute break, grab some water." The kids filed out, chattering excitedly, shooting curious glances at the man in the expensive, wrinkled suit standing awkwardly by the door. Finally, they were alone. The silence was deafening. It was filled with the ghosts of everything Julian had said, everything he had done. Marcus stood by the whiteboard, his arms crossed, waiting. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was just present. Julian swallowed the lump of pride in his throat. It tasted like ash. "Marcus," he began, his voice hoarse, "the company, it's gone." "No," Marcus said calmly. "The company is exactly where you left it. It was built on a fragile foundation you refused to maintain. I was just the guy patching the cracks. The cracks were always there." Julian took a step forward. "I was wrong. I was ignorant. I didn't understand." "You didn't want to understand," Marcus corrected him. "You wanted a scapegoat." The truth of it, so plainly spoken, was a punch to the gut. Julian had no defense, no spin, no clever retort. He was stripped bare. "Please," Julian whispered, the word tearing from his throat. "You have to come back. Name your price, any price. I'll give you half the company. Just fix it." Marcus walked slowly toward him. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze level. "This isn't about money, Julian. You still don't get it. This was never about the money for me. This was about the work, the creation, the respect for the craft." He gestured to the empty room. "This is what I care about, building things that last, empowering people." He looked Julian up and down at the ruin of a man before him. "You want me to fix your company?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping low. "Fine, I will, but not for money, not for stock, not for a title." Julian looked up, a desperate flicker of hope in his eyes. "Then what? What do you want?" Marcus's expression hardened, the quiet pity replaced by a cold, sharp demand. "I want a confession." Julian stared. "A confession?" "You're going to call an all-hands meeting," Marcus said, his voice like flint. "Live-streamed, board members, investors, every last employee, everyone who saw you humiliate me, and you're going to stand up in front of them and you're going to read a statement." "What statement?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "A statement that I will write for you," Marcus continued, his eyes boring into Julian's. "It will detail every warning I gave you. It will detail your dismissals of those warnings. It will state in no uncertain terms that the catastrophic failure of Innovatech was not a result of legacy code, but a result of your catastrophic and willful ignorance. It will state that you publicly fired me not for incompetence, but to create a scapegoat for your own failures in leadership." Julian's face went white. You can't ask me to do that. It would be professional suicide. The board would oust me. The investors would revolt." "Already doing that," Marcus said flatly. "The only difference is this way you get to tell the truth for once in your life. This way you might save the jobs of the 800 people who are about to be unemployed because of you." He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "And you will apologize, not to me. I don't want your apology. You will apologize to your employees for your failure to lead, for your arrogance, for your disrespect not just for me, but for the very work that made you rich." This was the price, not money, not power, humiliation, a public stripping of the ego as complete and brutal as the one he had inflicted on Marcus. It was poetic, it was devastating, it was justice. "That's the deal," Marcus said, his voice final. "You read my statement word for word. You swallow your pride and own what you did. Then and only then will I touch your code." He turned to walk away. "Wait," Julian called out, his voice cracking. Marcus stopped, his back to him. Julian looked around the peeling basement room, at the worn-out computers and the hopeful scrawls on the whiteboard. He looked at the man who held the fate of his entire world in his hands. He was a king with no kingdom, begging at the feet of the man he had exiled. He closed his eyes. The faces of his employees flashed in his mind. The headlines, the dead stock ticker, the look of pity in Marcus's eyes as he'd walked out of the war room. He had no choice. He had never really had one. He opened his eyes, defeated. "When do we start?" he whispered to Marcus's back. Marcus didn't turn around. "I'll email you the statement tonight," he said. "The meeting is tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." The Innovatech all-hands meeting was a funeral. The employees gathered in the main auditorium, their faces grim, their whispers hushed. The live stream counter showed thousands of viewers, investors, reporters, former employees, all tuned in to watch the execution. Julian Croft stood at the podium on stage, a single sheet of paper trembling in his hand. He looked smaller than they had ever seen him. The charismatic suit was just a costume hanging off a broken man. He looked out at the sea of faces. Elena stood in the front row, her expression unreadable. In the back of the room, unseen by most, stood Marcus. He wore the same simple clothes he'd worn at the community center. His arms were crossed. He was just watching, a silent observer at the trial he had orchestrated. Julian cleared his throat. The microphone screeched. He began to read. His voice was flat, mechanical, stripped of all its usual bravado. He read Marcus's words. I am speaking to you today not as your CEO, but as a failed leader. He detailed the ignored warnings, the denied budgets, the focus on superficial aesthetics over foundational stability. The recent system-wide collapse was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of my leadership, a failure born of my own arrogance and my profound disrespect for the technical expertise that formed the backbone of this company. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the corporate doublespeak they were used to. This was raw. This was blood on the floor. Julian's voice hitched, but he forced himself to continue. I publicly blamed and terminated Marcus Cole, our lead systems architect. This was a lie. The room went dead silent. Mr. Cole was not the cause of the failure. For 15 years, he was the sole reason our fragile system did not fail sooner. He was not incompetent. He was the most competent person in this company. I fired him to create a scapegoat, to deflect blame for my own catastrophic and willful ignorance of the problems he repeatedly brought to my attention. Julian had to stop. He took a ragged breath. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for a second they met Marcus's. Marcus just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. Keep going. I apologize, Julian choked out, the words tasting like poison. Not for the stock price, not for the bad press. I apologize for fostering a culture where brilliance was overlooked and loyalty was punished. I apologize for my failure. The fault is mine, and mine alone. He finished. He lowered the paper. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't angry. It wasn't forgiving. It was the sound of a truth so heavy it sucked all the air out of the room. Julian Croft had just committed professional suicide, live, for the entire world to see. From the back of the room, Marcus turned and walked out. He didn't need to see the rest. He had work to do. For the next 72 hours, Marcus worked. He didn't work from the Innovatech war room. He refused. He worked from the community center basement with his students watching, captivated. He had them bring in a server rack and a high-speed line, turning the small room into a mission control. Julian had wanted him to fix the system. Marcus was going to do more. He was going to resurrect it. He plugged in his scarred keyboard and his fingers began to fly. It wasn't a repair job, it was a masterclass. He moved through the broken code like a surgeon, swift and precise. He didn't just patch the holes, he rewove the fabric. He dismantled the flawed additions Seth and the others had tried to force into the system. He rebuilt the corrupted databases from fragments and shadow logs he alone knew existed. He purged the malware that had flooded in through the vulnerabilities. His students watched, their eyes wide. They saw him write elegant, clean code that did in 10 lines what the younger engineers had failed to do in 1,000. They saw him navigate complex architecture with an instinct that felt like magic. They weren't just watching a man fix a computer. They were watching an artist restore a masterpiece. On the third day, he typed the final line of code. He hit enter. Across the city, in the silent, hollowed-out offices of Innovatech, the screens flickered. The red error logs vanished. The systems hummed back to life. The website reappeared. The app worked. The data was restored. Everything was back. But it was different. It was faster, more stable, more secure. It wasn't just fixed. It was better. It was what it should have been all along. Elena called him. Her voice was filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. It's perfect, Marcus. It's all back. How? Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking at the faces of the young, hopeful students around him. I just gave it a stronger foundation, he said. A week later, Julian Croft officially resigned. The board, having witnessed his public confession, had no choice. They offered Marcus the CEO position. He turned it down without a moment's hesitation. They offered him a massive consulting contract to stay on and manage the system. He turned that down too. He sent them a single invoice. 4 consulting services rendered. Amount $1. He didn't want their money, he didn't want their power. He had made his point. His final meeting was with Elena. She met him at the community center to give him his $1 check. The place was buzzing now. News of Marcus's story had spread. Donations had poured in. They had new computers, faster internet, and a waiting list for his class. What will you do now? Elena asked, handing him the check, which he folded and put in his pocket without looking at it. Marcus gestured to the room, to the kids huddled over their keyboards, their faces bright with discovery. "This," he said, "I'm going to keep doing this." He sat down at his old desk in front of his scarred keyboard. A young girl came up to him, pointing at a line of code on her screen. "Mr. Cole, I think I broke it." Marcus looked at her code, then smiled. "No, you didn't," he said, his voice gentle. "You just found a new way to build." Elena watched them for a moment, the fallen tech giant and the future rising from the ashes of his empire. She finally understood. Julian Croft had spent his life building a castle of glass, fragile and beautiful and ultimately empty. Marcus was teaching children how to build foundations of stone. And as he placed his fingers on those worn, familiar keys, he typed out the first lesson of the day, a quiet victor in a war no one had known he was fighting. He had taken the ultimate revenge, not by destroying his enemy, but by choosing to build something better in his place. Some victories are not about what you win, they are about what you refuse to lose.